In the summer of 1492, Christopher Columbus loaded something unusual into the hold of his ship before leaving the Canary Islands. Not gold. Not weapons. Not the spices he was famously searching for. He loaded sugar cane cuttings. Living plants, wrapped carefully and packed into the belly of a vessel headed for a world that Europeans had never seen. Columbus was not thinking about changing civilization. He was thinking about profit. Sugar was, at that moment, the most valuable agricultural commodity on Earth, worth more per pound than most workers earned in a week, and he wanted to grow it in the New World. What nobody understood in 1492 was that those cane cuttings would trigger a chain of consequences so vast and so violent that historians still argue about whether any single agricultural product has caused more human suffering. Sugar would drive the largest forced migration in human history. It would reshape the coastlines of 3 continents. It would rot the teeth of queens and collapse the economies of nations. It would create and destroy entire cultures, fuel revolutions, and eventually poison the modern world so quietly and so completely that most people consuming it right now have no idea it is doing so. All of it started with a grass. A tall, fibrous, incredibly sweet grass that grew in the river valleys of New Guinea roughly 10,000 years ago, and had absolutely no intention of conquering the world. 10,000 years ago, in the highlands of New Guinea, people discovered that if you chewed the stalks of a particular wild grass, something extraordinary happened in your mouth. A flood of sweetness. Pure, immediate, almost overwhelming sweetness of a kind that had no competition in the natural world. Honey existed, but bees were territorial and unpredictable. Fruit was seasonal and perishable. This grass, what we now call Saccharum officinarum, sugarcane, was different. It was abundant, it was cultivable, and it was intoxicating in the way that only things which activate deep biological reward systems can be. Human beings are hardwired to seek sweetness. It signals caloric density, ripeness, and safety in food. Finding a plant that delivered pure sweetness on demand was, from an evolutionary standpoint, roughly equivalent to finding a machine that printed money. The people of New Guinea began cultivating it. Then the people of the Philippines and Indonesia encountered it and began cultivating it. Then it moved into India, where something happened that changed everything. Sometime around 350 AD, during the reign of the Gupta Empire in northern India, someone figured out how to crystallize sugar cane juice into a granulated solid. This sounds simple. It was not. It required pressing the juice from the cane, boiling it, clarifying it, removing impurities, and then seeding the cooling liquid to force crystallization into recognizable grains. The result was a portable, stable, long-lasting form of sweetness that could be stored for months and transported across continents without spoiling. Before this moment, sugar was a local pleasure. After this moment, it was a global commodity waiting to happen. Indian traders called it khanda, the root word of the English candy. They exported it west along the Silk Road and east toward China, and every civilization that encountered crystallized sugar had the same reaction. They wanted more of it, and they were willing to pay almost anything to get it. By 600 AD, Persian kings were serving sugar confections at royal banquets as the ultimate symbol of wealth and refinement. When the Arab armies swept through Persia in the 7th century and encountered sugar cultivation for the first time, they immediately recognized what they had found. The Arabs did not just consume sugar. They systematized it. They took the Indian techniques, refined them, built industrial-scale production operations across their expanding empire, and planted cane across North Africa, Sicily, Spain, and the Eastern Mediterranean. They developed new processing methods, new products, new culinary applications. By 900 AD, Arab physicians were prescribing sugar as medicine for virtually every ailment from coughs to heart conditions. Pharmacies throughout the Arab world stocked it as a primary drug. The word syrup comes from the Arabic sharab. The word candy comes from the Arabic candy. The word sugar itself derives from the Sanskrit sharkara through the Arabic sucker. An entire vocabulary of sweetness traveled west with the commodity. And then the Crusaders arrived. When European soldiers marched into the Holy Land in the late 11th century looking for sacred territory, they found something that would arguably reshape their continent more profoundly than any religious conquest. They found sugar. The Crusader chronicler William of Tyre, writing in the 12th century, described sugar as a most precious product, very necessary for the use and health of mankind, which is found in small quantities in Antioch and in greater quantities in the county of Tripoli and other places. He was writing about it the way you might write about discovering oil. The Crusader states immediately began cultivating cane across the eastern Mediterranean, and when Crusaders returned home to France, England, and Germany, they brought with them a taste for sweetness that their home economies had no way of satisfying. Sugar began entering European markets in tiny, eye-wateringly expensive quantities. In 13th century England, it was sold by the gram at apothecary shops, locked behind counters next to medicinal herbs and imported spices. English royal household accounts from 1226 record the purchase of 3 pounds of sugar as a notable expense, the equivalent of several days' wages for a skilled craftsman. Henry III of England once ordered 3 pounds of sugar from the city of Winchester, and the order was treated as a significant royal procurement. For the next 2 centuries, sugar functioned in Europe almost entirely as a luxury medicine and a status symbol. Wealthy households displayed sugar sculptures called subtleties at grand banquets, elaborate architectural confections in the shape of castles, animals, and religious figures. They were not primarily meant to be eaten. They were meant to be seen. Having sugar on the table told your guests that you were rich enough to burn money for decoration. The richer you were, the more sugar you displayed and wasted. This was conspicuous consumption in its purest medieval form. But there was a problem. Supply was desperately limited. The eastern Mediterranean plantations were constantly disrupted by warfare and political instability. The Arab and Venetian merchants controlling the trade routes charged maximum prices. European demand was growing faster than supply could follow, and the price of sugar remained stubbornly, prohibitively high. Something had to change. And the something was geography. In the early 15th century, Portuguese sailors began pushing south and west into the Atlantic Ocean. They were looking for trade routes, new fishing grounds, and any advantage they could find over the Arab and Venetian merchants who controlled overland trade. When they reached the island of Madeira in 1419 and the Canary Islands shortly after, they found something valuable: volcanic soil of extraordinary fertility and a climate that was warm, wet, and almost perfectly suited for growing sugarcane. The Portuguese planted cane. They built mills. They refined the product. And they discovered that Atlantic island sugar could be produced at a fraction of the Eastern Mediterranean cost, which meant it could be sold at a fraction of the Eastern Mediterranean price, which meant that a luxury available only to royalty could become something that wealthy merchants, then prosperous tradespeople, then almost anyone with a little money could occasionally afford. By 1500, Madeira was the largest sugar producer in the world. By 1520, the Portuguese had carried the plantation model to Brazil, where the land was so vast and the climate so ideal that production could expand without any practical ceiling. There was just one problem, and it was the problem that would define the next 3 centuries of human history. Growing and processing sugarcane was backbreaking, relentless, dangerous work. The cane had to be cut by hand with machetes in brutal tropical heat. It had to be hauled to mills and pressed immediately before the juice fermented. The mills ran 24 hours a day during harvest, and the boiling rooms where juice was reduced to syrup were staggeringly hot and genuinely lethal. Early Portuguese planters tried using indigenous labor. Disease wiped out the indigenous population so fast that the labor supply collapsed almost immediately. They tried European indentured workers. The conditions were so brutal that they died or fled. And so the Portuguese made a decision. That would echo for 400 years. They turned to the African slave trade, which Arab merchants had been operating for centuries, and they scaled it beyond anything that had ever existed before. Here is a number that requires a moment to absorb. Between 1500 and 1900, approximately 12.5 million African men, women, and children were loaded onto ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean against their will. Of those, roughly 11 million survived the crossing. The majority of them ended up not in North America, as most people assume, but in the sugar colonies of the Caribbean and Brazil. Roughly 40% went to Brazil alone. Another 40% went to the Caribbean islands. The British colonies of Jamaica and Barbados, the French colonies of Saint-Domingue and Martinique, the Spanish islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. These were not farms. They were industrial operations running on human suffering. Sugar plantations had mortality rates that make them comparable to concentration camps by modern standards. On the most brutal Jamaican and Barbadian plantations, the average enslaved worker died within 7 years of arrival. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work people to death and purchase replacements than to provide conditions compatible with long-term survival. This was not an incidental cruelty. It was economic logic. The math of sugar required it. And the math of sugar was extraordinary. By the mid-18th century, sugar had become the most valuable commodity traded in the entire Western world. Not silk. Not gold. Not spices. Sugar. The British colony of Barbados, a small island that you could drive across in an hour, was generating more trade revenue than all of the North American colonies combined. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, in the western portion of the island of Hispaniola, was producing roughly 40% of Europe's sugar and more than half of its coffee, making it the single most profitable colony in the history of European imperialism. One small Caribbean island was generating wealth that dwarfed continents. The entire Atlantic economy was a triangle, and sugar was the prize at every corner. European manufactured goods went to Africa to purchase enslaved people. Enslaved people went to the Caribbean to produce sugar. Sugar and its byproducts, rum and molasses, went to Europe and to the North American colonies, where New England merchants grew wealthy processing and distributing it. Every point of that triangle made money. And every point of that triangle was built on the body of an enslaved African. If you are finding this history as important as it is devastating, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this every week where one commodity, one invention, or one decision quietly reshapes the entire world. The button is right below this video. The byproduct of sugar production that nobody talks about enough is rum. When cane juice is boiled down, the crystallized sugar is removed, and what remains is a dark, thick, sugar-rich liquid called molasses. For a long time, planters threw it away or fed it to livestock. Then someone discovered that molasses ferments naturally into a crude alcoholic liquid, and that if you distill that liquid, you get rum. By 1700, rum had become the dominant alcohol of the Atlantic world. New England had more than 100 rum distilleries. The Royal Navy issued daily rum rations to every sailor aboard British ships, a practice that continued until 1970. Rum funded the construction of Harvard University. The slave trade itself was partially lubricated by rum, with New England merchants trading barrels of it in West African ports for enslaved people. The grass from New Guinea had become the engine of an entire civilization's economy, and the fuel it ran on was human bondage. In 1601, Queen Elizabeth I of England received a delegation of foreign ambassadors. The ambassadors were struck, and later recorded in their dispatches home, by an unusual feature of the Queen's appearance. Her teeth were black. Completely and visibly black. This was not, in 16th century England, considered a sign of poor hygiene or neglect. It was considered a sign of wealth. Black teeth meant you ate enough sugar to rot them. Among people who could not afford sugar, blackened teeth were occasionally faked, painted dark to give the impression of a sweetness habit only the rich could maintain. The Queen of England's rotting teeth were a status symbol. This tells you everything you need to know about where Europe was with sugar in the 16th century. It was still rare enough that its physical damage was considered aspirational. That would change with terrifying speed. As Caribbean plantations scaled up through the 17th and 18th centuries and the price of sugar dropped, consumption exploded. The average Englishman was consuming roughly 4 pounds of sugar per year in 1700. By 1800, that number had risen to 18 pounds. By 1900, it was 100 pounds per year. Sugar stopped being a luxury and became a staple. It entered tea, which the British were consuming in vast quantities, transforming that beverage from a bitter medicinal drink into a sweet daily ritual. It entered bread, jam, biscuits, puddings, and pies. The British working class, which could not afford meat, protein, or fresh vegetables in reliable quantities, was increasingly surviving on a diet built substantially around cheap sugar calories. This was not comfort. It was a nutritional catastrophe that took generations to fully reveal itself in the form of rotten teeth, diabetic populations, and cardiovascular disease on a mass scale. But in the short term, it kept factory workers moving and cost almost nothing. The British government understood exactly what sugar was doing to its population and chose to look away because the revenue was too important. By the late 18th century, sugar duties were generating more tax income for the British Crown than almost any other commodity. The sugar lobby in Parliament was one of the most powerful political forces in the country. The West India planters, as they called themselves, sat in the House of Commons, donated to political campaigns, and blocked every attempt to reform or regulate the trade for decades. They did not oppose slavery reform because they were unusually cruel men by the standards of their time. They opposed it because ending slavery meant ending the math that made their fortunes possible. The economics of sugar were inseparable from the economics of human bondage, and both were inseparable from the economics of the British Empire. On the night of August 22, 1791, on the French colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved workers on sugar plantations rose up in the largest and most successful slave rebellion in human history. Within weeks, they had burned more than 1,000 plantations and killed hundreds of white colonists. Within 13 years, after defeating French, British, and Spanish armies sent to suppress them, they had established the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The nation they founded was Haiti. The Haitian Revolution was driven by many forces: Enlightenment ideas about liberty that the French Revolution had unleashed, the extraordinary brutality of Saint-Domingue's plantation system, the military genius of leaders like Toussaint Louverture, and the chaotic politics of revolutionary Europe. But at its foundation was sugar. Saint-Domingue was the wealthiest colony on Earth precisely because it was the most brutally efficient sugar producer on Earth. The enslaved population was 70% of the total, worked with a ferocity that produced maximum output and maximum death rates. The revolution was the direct and inevitable consequence of building an economy on that foundation. The consequences of the Haitian Revolution spread far beyond the Caribbean. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had planned to rebuild the French Empire in the Americas using Saint-Domingue as its economic engine, found himself without a viable Western Hemisphere strategy when the colony was lost. He sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803 for $15 million. Historians have noted that the Haitian Revolution effectively doubled the size of the United States. The land that became Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and portions of a dozen other states was acquired because sugar workers in the Caribbean refused to be slaves any longer. The implications of that are almost impossible to fully absorb. Meanwhile, the collapse of Saint-Domingue sugar production created an immediate vacuum that Cuba rushed to fill. Spanish Cuba, which had been a relatively minor producer, rapidly scaled its plantation system using enslaved workers and became the dominant Caribbean producer by the early 19th century. The Cuban sugar boom funded the construction of Havana's grand architecture, made a small class of Cuban planters fabulously wealthy, and created the conditions for the Cuban Wars of Independence later in the century. Sugar wrote Cuban history the same way it had written Haitian history, in the ink of suffering and revolution. In 1791, the same year the Haitian Revolution began, a quiet movement was spreading through British households. Groups of Quakers and abolitionists were asking families to stop buying sugar. Not to lobby Parliament. Not to march. Simply to stop purchasing a product they described, accurately, as being soaked in the blood of enslaved people. Pamphlets circulated with titles like Reasons for Using East India Sugar, explaining that purchasing sugar from British India, where production did not depend on Atlantic slavery, was a moral act. Some estimates suggest that 300,000 British households boycotted slave-produced sugar during the 1790s. This was the first major consumer boycott in modern history, and it anticipated by 2 centuries the kind of ethical consumption movements that are now familiar in every supermarket. The boycott did not end slavery. What ended slavery, in the British Empire at least, was a combination of prolonged abolitionist campaigning, the economic argument that free labor was ultimately more productive than enslaved labor, and the inescapable moral weight of the Haitian example proving that the enslaved would eventually fight back with consequences too expensive to absorb. The Slavery Abolition Act passed in 1833, and the British government paid £20 million in compensation. Not to the enslaved people. To the slave owners. The British taxpayer was still paying off the debt taken out to fund that compensation when it was finally retired in 2015. 215 years after the Haitian Revolution, British taxpayers were still, technically, paying reparations to the descendants of slave owners for the loss of their human property. Sugar made that debt. The British public paid it. By the mid-19th century, something new was threatening the Caribbean sugar monopoly. European scientists had discovered that sugar could be extracted from sugar beet, a common root vegetable that grew in temperate climates. Napoleon had sponsored beet sugar research as a way to circumvent the British naval blockade that cut France off from Caribbean supplies. By the 1870s, European beet sugar production was competing seriously with cane sugar. By 1900, beet sugar accounted for more than half of global production. The price of sugar collapsed. What had been a luxury for aristocrats in the 13th century, a status symbol for the wealthy in the 16th, and a modest treat for the middle class in the 18th, was now cheaper than almost any other caloric source available. Processed food manufacturers noticed immediately. In the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th, industrial food production was transforming what people ate. Canned goods, packaged biscuits, mass-produced bread, bottled sauces, breakfast cereals, carbonated drinks. Every single category of processed food discovered that adding sugar improved palatability, extended shelf life, masked the off flavors of cheap ingredients, and most importantly, created a mild but real neurological reward response that made people want more of the product. This was not an accident. Food manufacturers understood what they were doing. Sugar was cheap, it was legal, it was unregulated, and it activated the same dopamine pathways that make addictive substances compelling. The industrial food system built its entire architecture around that fact. In 1972, a British physiologist named John Yudkin published a book called Pure, White and Deadly, in which he argued that sugar, not dietary fat, was the primary driver of obesity, heart disease, and metabolic illness in the modern world. His evidence was substantial. His argument was compelling. And it was immediately and systematically attacked by the sugar industry, which funded counter-research, recruited prominent scientists to publish contradictory findings, and waged a public relations campaign to shift blame onto dietary fat instead. Internal documents uncovered by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco in 2016 revealed that the Sugar Research Foundation had paid scientists in the 1960s to produce studies exonerating sugar and implicating fat. This strategy worked with devastating effectiveness for roughly 50 years. The low-fat dietary guidelines that dominated Western nutrition advice from the 1970s through the 1990s were, in substantial part, the product of a sugar industry disinformation campaign. While people were removing fat from their diets in the belief that fat was killing them, food manufacturers replaced the fat with sugar to maintain palatability, and metabolic disease continued climbing. Today the numbers are staggering. The average American consumes approximately 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day. The recommended maximum is 6 teaspoons for women and 9 for men. Global sugar consumption has increased by more than 50% in the last 30 years. Type 2 diabetes, which was once considered a rare condition, now affects more than 500 million people worldwide. Obesity-related illness is projected to cost the global economy $30 trillion over the next 2 decades. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, driven primarily by excessive fructose consumption, is now the most common liver condition in the developed world. The grass from the highlands of New Guinea has completed its journey. It started as a local pleasure. It became a global luxury. It fueled an empire built on slavery. It drove revolutions and doubled the size of nations. And it is now quietly metabolizing inside 500 million diabetic bodies as the most successful, the most profitable, and arguably the most destructive crop in the history of human civilization. Look around you at the modern world and trace the fingerprints of sugar. The racial demographics of the United States, the Caribbean, and Brazil are direct products of the Atlantic slave trade that sugar made necessary and profitable. The economic geography of the American South, which grew cotton rather than cane but used the plantation system and slave labor that sugar had pioneered, carries the structural imprint of the sugar economy. The financial institutions of London, Amsterdam, and Boston were built on capital that sugar generated. The legal frameworks that define enslaved people as property rather than persons were developed and refined in the sugar colonies before being applied anywhere else. The Caribbean itself, arguably the region most completely shaped by sugar, is still living with the consequences. Haiti, the nation born from the revolution against sugar slavery, remains the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The social scientists and economists who study Caribbean development describe a phenomenon called the sugar trap, in which the colonial plantation system so thoroughly destroyed indigenous institutions, traditional agriculture, mixed economic development, and social structures that the resulting societies found themselves, at independence, with nothing but a sugar monoculture and the social trauma of centuries of brutality to build from. The countries that were most valuable to European empires because of sugar are, today, among the least economically developed on Earth. The correlation is not coincidental. And now there is a new chapter being written. As the health consequences of industrial sugar consumption become impossible to ignore, as governments begin taxing sugary drinks and restricting sugar marketing to children, as consumers in wealthy countries tentatively begin reducing consumption, the global food industry is responding not by fundamentally changing its products but by finding new markets in the developing world where regulatory frameworks are weaker and health awareness is lower. The same playbook the tobacco industry ran for decades is being run again. Push the harmful product toward populations less equipped to resist it, fund research to muddy the scientific consensus, lobby against regulation, and count the profits while the public health system absorbs the costs. Willis Carrier fixed the ink on a printing press and accidentally reshaped the political map of the United States. A farmer in New Guinea chewed a stalk of wild grass and accidentally set in motion a chain of events that moved 12 million people across an ocean, built and destroyed empires, and is now metabolizing in the bodies of 500 million people with chronic disease. The scale of unintended consequences in both stories is nearly identical. But there is a difference. The air conditioner made places livable. Sugar made lives shorter. And the world is still, after 10,000 years, completely unable to stop wanting it. In 1492, Christopher Columbus loaded sugar cane cuttings into the hold of a ship in the Canary Islands. He was thinking about profit. He was thinking about how the fertile soils of whatever lands lay to the west might finally allow Europe to grow its own sugar at scale, cutting out the Arab and Venetian middlemen and making fortunes for whoever got there first. He was not thinking about the 12 million Africans who would be taken from their homes to work those fields. He was not thinking about the revolutions that would erupt when those workers decided they would not be property. He was not thinking about the British taxpayers who would still be servicing the debt from slavery compensation 6 centuries after his voyage. He was not thinking about the 500 million people who would one day have their pancreatic function disrupted by the industrial descendant of those cane cuttings. He was thinking about the sweetness. He wanted the sweetness. And so, it turns out, did everyone else. And that wanting, that deep, biological, ancient, irresistible human craving for sweetness, is the thread that runs through all of it, from the highlands of New Guinea 10,000 years ago to the nutritional label on whatever you are eating right now. The sweetness was always real. The cost of it was something else entirely.